Welcome to JGTCR, I'm Cope, and today we are tuning the BMW M3 Sport Evolution. Let's get into it. Considering its age, this vehicle does exceptionally well. We went into this expecting a sloppy, slippery sponge fest, but we were pleasantly surprised with how the car handles in factory trim. The steering is quite impressive. It is very easy to place this vehicle on the track and throw into turns. And even if we come in a touch too hot, it shows us a little bit of understeer, not to punish us, just to let us know we are at its limit. When pushing through turns at the limit of traction, the tail end likes to step out slightly. This drift style racing can be forced with a good jab of the brakes on entry of turns. But while it is good fun, it is not necessarily the fastest way around a turn. The power and power delivery is nothing to write home about, but we can get up and moving if we keep the momentum going. First and second gear are far too wheel spinny and torquey to be used while cornering. Both of these gears should only be used if absolutely necessary, and when we do use them, it should only be to rotate the vehicle. By the time we get back on the accelerator on corner exit, we should be back in third. The brakes work well enough, but there is definitely a floaty sensation when they are applied. This can also lead to the car getting squirrely on entry if we are too aggressive on the brakes. Let's collect our time. 8 minutes, 13.5 seconds. Let's take a look at the tune. The race tune on the M3 Sport focused on dealing with mild understeer and oversteer. To manage the understeer, we made sure our body height adjustment was lower at the front than it was at the rear. Our anti-roll bar was also softer at the front than it was at the rear. And finally, we increased our front downforce. And to deal with the oversteer, we made sure the natural frequency was softer at the rear than the front. And of course, we increased the downforce over the rear. And with all of that sorted, let's see how it performs on the Nürburgring. When completely modified and tuned, there is definitely a very raw feeling when driving this M3. The engine sound is loud and raspy. We also have to wring the neck out of it to get it moving and keep it going. The handling is good until it isn't. Unfortunately, the suspension needs to be very firm to stabilize the car, but this makes the ride bumpy and we can bounce aggressively if we hit a curb the wrong way or find a decent dip in the road. The steering itself is great. Most of our understeer issues are gone, and what remains is a solid performing turning experience. While the power has increased after modification, the power itself still feels rather low. The delivery of that power is not aggressive, but combined with heavy-handed steering, we can experience traction loss and delve into the area of drift racing. The tail end also likes to step out when pushing too hard, but fortunately for us, it is very manageable. Under brakes, this M3 is now extremely solid. We can now brake much more aggressively without the fear of getting squirrely. Let's collect our time. 6 minutes, 42.8 seconds. And now the drift tune. As much as the M3 likes to drift race, when it comes to straight drifting, the tail end was being a touch moody. The issue seems to be that it has both too much traction and not enough traction. The tune balances most of this issue out, however, there is more work to be done here. Let's drift Suzuka. The BMW M3 Sport Evolution is a grip drifter. We need to wring the neck out of this vehicle and keep it at high RPM to maintain drift. So if we want to be successful, we have to employ a more of a kamikaze style drift, where we throw it into turns aggressively, plant the throttle, and furiously manage the steering throughout the drift, avoiding gripping back up. Unfortunately, the moody tail end has forced us to add downforce and ballast. This did stabilize the rear, but it also makes holding a drift more difficult as we have too much traction. The handling while drifting is actually quite good. The M3 is easy to place on track while drifting. Its maneuverability is reliable and it does not fight us too much. The power delivery is lazy in the higher gears, however, it is very peaky in the lower gears. So while this setup may work, manual adjustment of the gear ratios is necessary to turn this into a better drift car. But unfortunately, our 20 minutes of tune was up before we managed to get to it. Let's do an engine swap. The BMW M3 Sport Evolution with just the engine swap becomes a very sloppy vehicle indeed. It seems the suspension is no longer able to keep up with the demands of the engine and the chassis. The decent handling we once had has been thrown right out the window, and what we are left with is a very moody and indecisive vehicle. There is a constant battle between understeer and oversteer, but no matter which way this M3 decides to go, in the end it's always us as the driver that loses out. The understeer is both Mr. Plow on entry and very floaty on corner exit, while the oversteer lacks direction and control in addition to being very snappy Tom in nature. The power delivery is now extremely aggressive. Realistically, the lowest usable gear is third, and even then its effectiveness is limited. We must use carefully curated throttle modulation to maintain traction while in third gear. The fact is that wheel spin can occur at any time, so caution is advised. The slides themselves can be controlled, however we do lose a lot of time. As such, it's best to short shift if we want to see the best results in our lap times. When it comes to braking, they work okay, but we can get wobbly and squirrely if we're too aggressive or try to brake and turn. Let's collect our time. 7 minutes 48.2 seconds. And now the tune. There was a lot of oversteer and a touch of understeer to contend with when tuning the M3 Sport Evolution. The understeer was easily fixed by having our body height adjustment lower at the front than the rear and our roll bar being softer at the front than at the rear. The natural frequency was also kept soft at the front and the icing on the cake was the front downforce. The greater part of tackling the oversteer issue lies in the differential. The initial torque was kept high for predictability, but the acceleration sensitivity was reduced to 8 points. This helps make power delivery less aggressive and snappy. The ballast over the rear wheels also played a major role in taming the tail end. Let's test it out on track. When completely modified and tuned, the BMW M3 Sport Evo is an absolute monster, in both a good way and a bad way. Yes, that's right, we seem to have a Jekyll and Hyde situation. This M3 can be driven very fast, but should we set 1 foot out of place, this vehicle is more than willing to end our race. The handling has 2 modes, when we have traction and when we don't. When we have traction, handling is solid, the car responds to our inputs and all is good in life. But when we lose traction, the steering becomes janky and erratic, making a mess of our lap time and overall being an absolute nightmare. If there's anything to take away from this conversation, it's don't lose traction. When it comes to power delivery, it is extremely aggressive. This makes keeping traction a difficult task. If conditions are not perfect, it more than likely will break traction. And even if conditions are perfect, it can still break traction. As we make our way through the rev range, there is an extremely nasty peak between 6,000 and 7,500 RPM. This very much seems to be the Achilles heel of this vehicle. This area of the rev range is where the tail can snap out instantly and send us to Neverland. Fortunately for us, we can thwart this traction demon by using 90% throttle should we become unstable. Another useful method is to upshift to the next gear should we start losing traction. When this M3 is not wheel spinning, it is a beast. There is a huge amount of pull from this car and it just keeps going the whole way through the rev range. So once we figure out how it responds to our inputs, we get to see the potential this M3 has when it's completely unleashed. The brakes are as solid as they come and should be the go-to if things go awry when pushing too hard. Let's collect our time. 6 minutes, 16.7 seconds. And now the drift tune. The first thing to note on our drift tune is that we are using the medium turbo. The power delivery of the high turbo was too aggressive for drifting. And if we're being honest, even the medium turbo may be a touch too aggressive for this application. This is reflected in our tune where we had to go to some extremes to balance out the drift settings. Let's drift Suzuka. The BMW M3 Sport Evolution with the engine swap has a lot more power. This makes drifting a much easier task than in the factory engines model, but the drive feel we get when drifting this rendition is a very different sensation. It is very much a drift missile more than anything else. While drifting, it picks up speed post-haste, so it can get away from us very quickly if we don't keep it in check. The handling while drifting is great. It is considerably agile and is easy to maneuver on track, but it can get wobbly on switches and transitions. It also has a tendency to go wide in drifts, especially at high RPM. This is due in part to the extra weight over the rear wheels trying to drag the car off the circuit. The power delivery is solid, but it can be a touch lazy in the higher gears. It can take an extra moment for it to come on full song, but when it does, it cooks those tires like it's a master chef. And that's all we have for you today, so until next time, keep racing!